Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Monica Staaf, and I'm the General Counsel for the Rhode Island Association of Realtors and statewide MLS. And thank you for joining us with our latest settlement drop-in. So I've got my trusty colleague, John Breault, the Vice President of MLS with me. And also, John, we're hitting the big time here today because we actually have a guest with us today. It's like we have our own show or something, right?
That's amazing. Boy, we should take this show on the road.
I know, start our own TV show. Anyway, so our special guest this morning is Waldy Ripoll. Waldy is, and I'll give him a proper, more detailed introduction later, but Waldy is the sales manager and team leader for Movement Mortgage. And that is some area that we've been kind of missing in John's and my expertise. We know the MLS rules, we know the settlement agreement, we know the legal issues, but what about the mortgage and how we all make this work, how we get you paid? So John and Waldy, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, John. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. And thank you all for joining us. So I'll just set a couple of housekeeping rules and then walk you through things, what we'll be doing today and start thinking of some questions that you might have. All right, so our program today is being recorded. So if you have to duck out early or know a friend who you think should have seen this but didn't, feel free to share it. We'll have the link posted on RIRealtors.org as usual under the settlement resources, and that will happen sometime tomorrow. This session is going to go from 11 to 12:30 today. And what am I missing? Oh, yeah. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And I think you know the drill, those of you who have been attending these, but we won't be able to unmute you and ask questions live, but you can certainly type them in the Q&A. So I think what our format today will be, John, I think has some updates that he would like to share. I'll have a few short updates, about probably 5 minutes worth of content. And then we will turn things over to the star of our show, who we've already gathered some questions for Waldy to answer for us, burning questions on the lending front. And then, like I said, in the meantime, think of any questions that you might want to ask Waldy, or John and I are also fair game too. Okay, so John, what would you like to share with us today?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. And again, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us yet again. Happy to have you here. So, as in the past, this is an opportunity. It's going to be interactive, and we really just like this forum to be pretty open to answer your questions. We've been living with the settlement, the new rules now for about a month and a half, right? Roughly. The number of questions we've received have really died down quite a bit. I think as people are putting transactions together and moving forward, they're sort of getting a feel for this and how it's working out. And so I think that's a good thing. On the compensation front, from an MLS perspective, we really haven't had to deal with a lot in terms of infractions or that. There's been a couple of issues that we've had to deal with where folks are attaching compensation information to their listings, which, as we know, is prohibited. As we've said before, there can be no references anywhere in a listing to compensation, including the attachments. So those have been pretty simple. I guess the big thing now is that because we've had these new rules, we have adopted now some penalties for violations of these rules, and so of course we're not big on wanting to fine folks, but the rules need to have some teeth, and so there were two new fines or penalties that were adopted recently. One related to including references to compensation anywhere in a listing, and it's I don't have the specific amounts, but generally it follows the format of some of our other fines, where it's really a graduated offense. You'll get a warning the first time, and eventually it'll go up to, I think $5,000 to potentially $1,000 at some point. Repeat offenders potentially could face suspension. And it's the same thing with regards to the mandatory buyer written agreement. That's a requirement now under the settlement and under the MLS rules. So in a similar fashion, if licensees are not getting that agreement signed, then potentially there would be a warning and subsequent fines and ultimately suspension for repeat violators. So I think that's really the only change. Monica, that I wanted to make sure I alluded to that in previous sessions, but now we actually have the fines in place, and we'll be posting those on our website along with all the other fines as well.
Okay, well, thank you for that update, John. And my update's pretty short as well. It's in terms of the kind of calls I've been getting, my legal hotline calls doubled in July and August from same time in previous years. You can probably guess what most of those calls were about since you've been living it. Now my calls are starting to switch for September, kind of half compensation, half questions about the lead registry. Whole other webinar, but just want to put that out there. So the only couple of things I want to mention, what I continue to get a lot of calls about is an open house scenario. An unrepresented buyer, what sounds like a start of a joke, but it's not. An unrepresented buyer walks into an open house or goes to the listing broker directly for a showing. And so people are wondering, does that buyer have to sign a contract? If the listing broker who's handling that showing represents the seller exclusively, so no dual facilitation, anything like that, only is going to represent the seller, then they're not required to have a contract to show the buyer the property, or even put together assist the buyer with putting together a purchase and sales agreement, as long as that relationship is not going to change throughout the transaction. One thing, and I will post this in the chat, and I'm going to see, John's going to laugh at me because I usually botch this up when I try this, but I'm going to venture a quick screen share. Okay, except I'm not showing full screen here. All right, let me try and fix that piece of it. All right, page width. Waldy and John, can you see this? Okay, yay, okay, I got it, yeah. All right, so this is one of the resources. Now what? You're making
No, I'm just like amazing. Go ahead.
It's amazing for me. I know the legal stuff. I'm not the tech guru around here, and I'm certainly not the tech help desk. Anyway, okay, so here's a new resource from the RIAR Risk Management Committee. We put out an earlier version of the spring. This has been updated. What it is, this is double trouble for realtors. So basically, and I'll put the link in the chat, but it just walks you through different options, what to do in that scenario when that buyer walks in unrepresented. So just some things for you, if any brokers, principal brokers are listening too. If you haven't really set policies for your brokerage, this will give you a little bit of food for thought. I know I'm kind of whipping through this, but it's just giving you options in that scenario. And we also have a separate piece for consumers that talks about going to an open house, know your rights, and I'll put links to both of those in the chat. Okay, and then as a quick reminder for anybody who is just joining us, I see someone's already put a question in the Q&A. So we will hold on to those questions because we already have some prepared ones, but please keep adding those as you think of them. And Waldy is the main person on the hot seat today, but if you want to ask John some tough questions, feel free. I'm the moderator, so leave me alone.
No, there you go. You're a panelist. Actually, this question might actually be a good question to sort of answer because it's a nice transition into what Waldy is here to talk about, I think. And so the question really is there a rule that listing brokers should no longer write a check to the co-broke office, but rather have the closing attorney handle the compensation where applicable? Speaking first to the MLS rules, and then we can sort of go into what one of the reasons we have Waldy here, which is, in practice, how are these things working out there in the field, and are there better ways to handle it than other ways? Certainly there are options. But first, while broker to broker compensation is no longer permitted in the MLS, it's still allowed out there in the real world, we'll say. However, the Department of Justice has sort of frowned upon it, right? They suggest they'd rather not see broker to broker compensation at all. So to answer this question directly, there is no rule that says a broker can no longer write a check, right? You can continue as a broker to do business the way you have in terms of collecting compensation, and I guess holding it into escrow if that's what you've done before, and writing those checks, etc. If that's the way you choose to move forward. But I think as we talk through this and think about the way transactions are working, maybe that's not the best way to do it. So, Waldy, I guess this is good times. What are you seeing out there just specifically related to this? Are brokers still showing up with broker to broker compensation checks at closing, or how is that sort of playing out?
Well, that's a great question, John. So as of now, I haven't seen like brokers showing up at the closing, trying to get compensated to another broker. So but what I wanna add to the whole topic, now more than ever, is very important to align with the right lender, because with all the changes in the industry, you need to align with the right lender, because everything starts at the pre-approval stage. So once the borrower meet with the lender go over numbers, the lender can start educating that particular client to understand that there's gonna be a fee associated, that can potentially be a fee associated to pay the buyer's commission. So it's very important to educate the client right at the beginning of the pre-approval stage. So to me, it's very important who you align with. So the lender can start educating that particular client, so they can mentally prepare and financially. So
Yeah. So we've been sort of recommending that. So taking it a step back, in just signing contracts with consumers, whether you're the listing broker or the buyer representative, right, Monica, where the conversations need to start early, right? And that's actually part of the requirements with the settlement, in terms of disclosing and the transparency to the consumer, and that, who do you work for and what are you getting paid, and, and who's paying you and all those things. And so, Monica, do you want to speak to that? I know you're the host, but I'm throwing some questions at you.
I can answer that, and then I'm going to give Waldy a more detailed introduction, since some people might have just joined us a few minutes into the podcast. But yeah, actually, I just was asked to do a podcast for some closing attorneys who are part of a title company last week, and the attorneys who hosted it gathered some questions. That same question was one that some of the closing attorneys were asking: are we going to have to start issuing 1099s? If we're having the listing broker transfer that money to the closing attorney, what might have gone to a cooperating broker in the past, directly listing broker to cooperating broker, will they be asked to bring that to the closing, or prior transfer to the lender before the closing, or to the closing attorney before the closing? Yeah, and so the attorneys were saying, are we going to have to be the ones issuing 1099s now, instead of the listing broker used to do that? So yeah, I think as people start transitioning how they're structuring compensation, if it's shifting from broker to broker to seller to cooperating broker, yeah, I think you're going to see more of that. I can tell Waldy's champing at the bit here, so let me get the introduction out of the way so we can continue here. So Waldy Ripoll.
yes.
No, I just did it wrong. Got the accent wrong. Oh, I'm botching this already. Waldy Ripoll.
Yes.
Yes. I'm sorry about that.
You're fired, Monica. You're fired.
I know, everyone butchers my last name too, so I was trying to be so careful. So Waldy Ripoll is the sales manager and team leader for Movement Mortgage. He also is licensed as a mortgage broker in 3 states, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. And Waldy is a member of the Young Professionals Network, as well as NAREP, which is the National Association for Hispanic Professionals. And is there anything else I need to tell them about you, Waldy? Or is there anything you would like to add about yourself?
So I'm bilingual, so I speak Spanish fluently. So and I think you covered most of the part.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have some more questions to get to, and then we'll see what people might be posting in the Q&A. And then John, if there are any you want to add to our list. So actually, with the question that someone just posted that John just read is one that we'd already sent to Waldy in advance. So weren't we smart? Anyway, about the concession piece. So Waldy, it's kind of the intro question is, as the real estate profession shifts from a listing broker offering compensation to a cooperating broker to a seller or buyer paying the cooperating broker, what kind of changes are you anticipating in the lending process?
So there's gonna be a little bit more flexibility. There's gonna be new programs that will allow the commission to be paid to the buyer's agent. As of now, movement itself has a down payment assistant that can be used for down payment, closing costs, and buyer's agent commission fee. So technically, Movement Mortgage has what we call Movement Boost, which this program is only allowed for FHA buyers. So the buyer can borrow 3.5% or 5% of the purchase price to cover all the fees. So it's a second lien. So they're gonna have a second monthly payment. So Movement has their own particular down payment assistant. Also, I want to add for a lot of down payment assistants that are available. So Rhode Island Housing does allow to use the down payment assistant program to cover the buyer's agent fee. So if you have a client that might be short on funds because they don't have enough cash to close, they can use the down payment assistant to cover for the buyer's agent's commission. Connecticut also does allow the down payment assistant to be able to use to cover the buyer's agent commission. Massachusetts does not allow the buyer's agent commission, to be paid with a down payment assistant.
So that's huge news.
Yeah, that is
exciting. Go ahead, John.
And so when we're talking about clients in this context, we're talking about buyers being able to get that assistance to pay their own representative, right? And in some cases, and I suppose in a lot of cases, where if a buyer can't get that assistance, what we're seeing is that they're putting in their offer, they're asking the seller to, pay, right? So however they negotiate that out, it becomes a negotiating thing, right? That, we'll pay X amount, and subject to the seller paying, X percent, to cover that cost. And that can be worked out a number of different ways, right? Either they're going to pay above, that much above asking or whatever. But I guess that can be done in one of two ways. And so my question really is to how does that work in the transaction, and is one way better than the other? And so in other words, does it make more sense for the seller to pay the buyer, and then the buyer uses that to pay their buyer representative, or for the seller just to pay the buyer representative directly? Are there differences and tax implications, et cetera, into how that gets folded into the financing?
So what I've been recently experienced where the buyer's agent increase the purchase price to ask for a seller concession to cover the fee within the seller concession. So that's one of the most common practice that I've been seeing, that they offer a little bit more money with the contingency that the seller cover the fee as a closing cost credit. Although, you have to be careful, because depending on the type of financing that the borrower does, if you don't mind, can I share a document with the seller concession or what program
Sure.
will allow?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, so let me just share this. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, you might want to zoom in, or maybe close the tools on the left, and then see if you on the bottom right, maybe just click the zoom in. There you go. That's a
Look,
little better, right?
Does that look better?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so like I was saying, depending on the program that the particular client's using, you have to be careful, because assuming you're trying to get X amount of percentage for your commission, and you buying a property for $300,000, or your particular buyers, put in an offer for $300,000, you have to be careful on how much you can ask for seller concession, because depending on the program, it varies the percentage that you can ask for the seller to cover. So I don't know if you can see my grid, but conventional will allow you up to 3% of the purchase price. FHA does allow up to 6% of the purchase price. BA does allow up to 4% of the purchase price, and USDA up to 6%. But it's also depend on how they buying the property. Are they buying the property as a primary? Are they buying the property as a second home? Are they buying the property as an investment? So you have to be aware, like, how are they buying this property, because the seller concession changes on the type of financing they're doing. Also, you have to also be careful, because depending on how much you offering, you have to do your market analysis. Will that property appraise at the value that you're trying to offer? So you have to be aware that, because you want to get your fee, will the price appraise at what you're trying to offer? So you want to also do a little bit more of research before you place your offer. This property can appraise. You can also talk to your lender, so, hey, what do you feel about me putting this offer? How can I structure this where I can get my fee? So your lender might be able to help you narrow what's the best practice for you to be able to get your compensation.
So to that point, that's a great point. And so that's one of the things we've been advising, obviously, is transparency and having conversations early and often with the lenders, and so that there are no surprises at the closing table, but certainly have those conversations so that you understand how to structure these things. But so, and I'm a little ignorant in these areas, so I'll ask these questions and not be too embarrassed. But and I think actually we have a question sort of related to this, but concessions are paid to the buyer, or are made to the buyer, but isn't a fee paid to a buyer broker separate from concessions, or not? So in other words, if the seller pays, instead of paying the concessions to the buyer to pay their broker, the seller actually pays the buyer broker directly. Is that still a concession, or is that separate?
So that is separate. So because the seller concession to the buyer, it goes, it gets funded to the buyer, and then the buyer out of that concession can be a split for, assuming that, let's just put a number. Assuming you get $20,000 seller concession, but the borrower closing costs are only $10,000. Now the borrower has an additional $10,000 that they can use to buy down the interest rate, to pay the buyer's agent. So, depending on how much money they have, they can use it to pay the buyer's agent, or even buy down the interest rate.
Okay.
And then we have a comment from one of the folks in the Q&A. So I'll read it quickly, but to avoid any potential, and this goes back to the question before about, what are you doing? Is the listing broker still holding funds, et cetera? So Deb writes, to avoid any potential violation from the lawsuit, we are no longer accepting escrows in our office. We do not want to participate in issuing commission checks to cooperating brokers, as it may be confused with our broker paying a buyer's broker. The escrow will be held by the title attorney or title company or seller's attorney. Compensation for each office will be a line item on the CD, and she thinks it's much cleaner that way. The majority of the state uses this process, and she's adopted it. She also thinks it's been working well in the last few months and would like to see that as the new process. Plus, it helps with escrow disputes. And that is an excellent point because, I always tell people who call me with deposit dispute questions, it's like a hot potato. As long as it's in your account, you're a target. Even if you can't control what the seller or buyer want to do with the escrow, you're a target as long as you're holding it. So if you want to get it out of there and send it over to the closing attorney, or have that, or as Deb had posted, have the seller's attorney have someone else hold the escrow account. Great for you if that's what's working for you.
And so we have another question that's sort of related to this, but it speaks again to listing brokers and what they intend to do with the sellers in the first place, right? So, in our exclusive listing agreement, we removed any reference to broker compensation, right? However, some people can adapt and continue to do that. So some brokerages are sort of trying to figure out how to hold on to the old model, right? Like as a listing broker, do I still collect the whole fee and then split it? And then if so, like as this question sort of contemplates, if I'm intending to collect the higher fee, I'll say that contemplates sharing a commission, but then the buyer pays their broker directly. This question asks, well, what do I do with the difference? Well, first of all, you need to spell that all out in your contract, right? That you're collecting X and what are you collecting X for? If part of X is to pay a cooperating broker Y, and then that no longer happens, well, then, contractually, you need to spell that all out up front. Like, well, then what's the expectation? Does that Y get deducted from your X or, what? So, but, I think this is why we're seeing that in practice now, brokerages, many, as Monica sort of mentioned, their escrow stuff is part of the reason, but just sort of the nuance of, maybe I'm just going to collect my fee as the listing broker in the listing agreement. And then the buyer representative will, through their offer, try to negotiate their fee, or they'll say, that's how we sort of handle that. And then as the listing broker, I don't have to worry about broker to broker compensation. As a buyer broker, I also don't have to worry about, how do I even make sure that I get paid from the listing broker? Because when the fee was an MLS, there was a requirement to pay and you had arbitration. Well, with that being gone, if the listing broker's telling me that they're going to pay me Y, well, what do I have in writing between the brokers to even cover that? You have to have some sort of document. So it feels like people are opting to handle this more transactionally, where put it in the offer, it'll get negotiated, the seller will pay it either as a concession or whatever, it gets put into the P&S, et cetera. So I'm rambling. I don't know. I'm not here to talk about these things. You are. So I just wanted to sort of throw that out here because I think some of the questions are this is what leads us to now, how does the transaction move forward, right? We have our listing agreement, but how do we move forward and as offers come in and financing gets put together? So presumably, Waldy, I guess those are maybe now as things are going, are those the questions? This goes back to what you're saying about partnering with a good firm, but also that dialogue. So presumably now you're sort of one of the first questions you're having to put together is like, well, who's paying who and how is that all working out? Correct?
Correct. Yes. So, for myself, I can speak for myself. I'm educating literally every single client that comes in about, the closing costs, the cash to close, how much money they can expect, so, and sort of educating at the same time that, they have to cover the fee for the buyer's agent, which, that can be potentially negotiated with the seller, but it's not going to happen in every case. So that way the buyers understand that financially if they're not ready, there's are available down payment assistance that we can utilize to help them achieve the transaction that they're looking for.
Great.
So, Waldy, one of the questions that we have is, some of these you've already addressed, but if a cooperating broker is going to be paid by a seller or by a buyer instead of a listing broker, what kind of documentation would you want to see as a lender? Like, do you need a copy of the buyer's contract with the cooperating broker? What would you be looking for?
Right. So we are looking for the buyer's agreement and compensation. And one of the things that we can, so it's very important for the agent to have that communication with the lender, because if they communicated with the lender, it's not going to be a surprise to the buyer at closing. Because if the buyer's agent disclose that to the lender, we can literally disclose right at the beginning of the transaction, where right on from the LE, the loan disclosures that goes out to the buyer as soon as we trigger the application, that fee is included on the cash to close. So if you do not share that document and you just share that document with the attorney, yes, the attorney would include that fee, but it's gonna be sort of a check to the buyers when they see, oh, it's an additional 5,000, it's an additional 10,000. How did that come up now? At closing.
Mhm.
So it's very important that you share with the lender that you are getting X amount of fee from the purchase price. So that way we can include that fee. We can build in that fee into the loan estimate that goes out to the buyer as soon as we trigger that application. So we're looking
Perfect.
for that buyer's representation agreement, yes.
And I think you said it before too, but kind of early and open communication, right, is really, no matter what lender anyone's working with, it just and also I know at a previous webinar that John and I did, someone had asked us to clarify that if you're a broker, cooperating broker, salesperson, whatever, whomever, that when you're contacting the buyer's letter, you want to make sure it's with the buyer's permission.
Correct.
Right. Because you don't want to start like saying, oh, here's my fee, and then the buyer really didn't sign something, or right. So
correct. So when we contacting the buyers to disclose any fees, we want to make sure that we have all enough information, so that way when we disclosing, hey, this is X amount of closing costs, they can potentially feel, oh, this is why is that too much? So we had to be able to disclose, and you have to be able to communicate to the buyer too that you're charging a fee. So it's very important, because it happened to me that I received the buyer's agreement, but the buyer was not aware, or was not like, she knew what she signed, but she was not super aware, because everything happened new. So I had to kind of like spend an hour and a half trying to explain the whole situation to the buyer, which then she was able to understand. But that is something that is very important, that you communicate with the buyer, that how much you're charging, because the seller might just be paid half of your fee, and you may want to collect half of your fee from the buyers. But how can you do that? You have to do the buyer's agreement, and you have to communicate to the lender, also to the buyer, so that way when we present in the fees and all this, the cash to close, how much they have to bring to the table, they understand what are we talking about. And it's gonna be a little bit more conversational for you with the buyer. But I personally, disclose everything from the pre-approval stage. So that way, once you sit down with the client to explain it, they already heard from the lender. And I'm sure if all the lenders start doing the same, it's gonna be a more or smooth and easier conversation for all the buyer's agent to present their fee to the buyers. It's not gonna be a surprise.
I'm sure everyone listening really appreciates that, because especially the person whoever the realtor was, who got the compensation after you spent an hour and a half with the buyer saying, yep, it looks like you really did sign a contract saying that you owe compensation. So, and one question I just wanted to ask before we lose sight of this, because I know it's important, it's a burning question. You've addressed a little bit before about some of the resources available, but what kind of impact do you think that this will have? There've been let me rephrase that. I'm too caffeinated today. I'll start all over again. But people in marginalized communities, you talked a little bit about maybe potential resources through Rhode Island Housing, but how do we make sure that people who might just be first-time home buyers or very, very limited funds, or people from communities that maybe have traditionally been discriminated against before, how do we make sure that they have access to representation?
So, like I touched base before, Rhode Island Housing is a great tool here in Rhode Island. Connecticut also is a great tool you can, most of these first-time buyers that are in marginalized communities, so they tend to opt in for the down payment assistance. They may need like the full down payment assistance just to cover the closing costs. That's where we have to be creative and sit down with the right lenders. Very important, because there's options that we can do as lenders. We may offer a little bit of a higher rate to give money back to the client, so the client can have enough money to pay their closing costs or their expenses. So there's other things that we can do as lenders to help out the client achieving, the financial goal, which is ultimately buying the home, and help out buying, paying for the buyer's agent commission.
So to that point, is down payment assistance through, for example, RI Housing readily available? Or, I mean, is it easy to get? Is it difficult to get? What are the challenges to getting that sort of assistance?
So, through the years, Rhode Island Housing has flexed a lot of their laws. Before, they used to be a little bit strict with a lot of things, but right now, the flexibility is really, really good. Our movement, we are delegated lenders, where we underwrite pretty much everything in-house. We don't have to go through Rhode Island Housing underwriters. So for us, it's pretty easy. And as far as getting the down payment assistance, also very easy, because now they increase the income limit, where before the income limit used to be very tight. So you can get the down payment assistance with a 620 FICO score. You can get down payment assistance also with a 660. So they have two programs that are readily available for literally, I would say, based on the income limit they have, you can literally get, I would say 90% of the population in Rhode Island can be able to access, the down payment assistance. Here at Movement, we also have down payment assistance where we can go up to 580 FICO score, and we can assist with the Movement Boost with a 3.5% or 5% of the purchase price, available for FHA buyers only. But Rhode Island Housing is available for not only FHA, it's also available for conventional, BA, USDA. So it's readily available for all type of financing. So you can have a BA buyer getting 100% financing, and you can still use the down payment assistance to cover the buyer's agent commission. So technically you have that, that money available not only to cover the closing cost, but also cover the buyer's agent commission.
Is there a limited pool of money? I mean, how does that work? Is that once the money runs out in a given year, it's gone, or
So the particular programs that they have available right now, they don't have a limit. So they do come up with some down payment assistance that is limited funds that they get through the state. They recently ran out of a grant that they were offering, which it was the 17,500. That money was, given, through COVID. So to help out with, down payment and closing costs. But, though that was so much funds that they got, and they ran out of funds. Once they ran out of funds, those are the standard programs they have right now, the 15 and the 20,000 down payment assistance program.
Excellent. So I think that's a good message for people to check whatever lenders you're working with. And if you have a client who's going through Rhode Island housing or need extra down payment assistance, see what kind of programs are available through that lender. And yeah, because it really is an important issue to make sure that people have, I mean, you think of all the clients, for all of you listening, all the clients with whom you've worked over the years. I mean, first-time home buyers in particular, if anybody needs representation, or maybe someone's for the first time, like in a family who's always rented, so they don't have that legacy from their parents to understand like what's involved with buying a home. Yeah, you just want to make sure that is available. I'm hoping we'll see some relief on the national level too, eventually on that front. So we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. There is one came earlier, and I just want to address it. We're not going to read the question because it is talking about specific numbers. But the question was, when we were talking about a listing broker, if compensation being paid by a buyer, or probably more commonly by the seller to a cooperating broker. What is the list, how does that all work up the listing broker's compensation? Let's just say whatever, I think probably the takeaway, and I've probably said it before with the settlement agreement. If you're the listing broker, it used to be under the old system that you're collecting total amount of compensation and then offering part of that to a cooperating broker with the seller's consent. What we're seeing, although some people are still trying to stick with the old ways, I sound old, it's only been 6 weeks, like John said before, but I'm sticking with the old ways. But we're seeing this shift, and not just in Rhode Island, but on the national level, away from the listing broker making a blanket offer of compensation to the cooperating broker. And so in the listing agreement, my best advice is going to be you do you. So if you're representing the seller, what do you want to be paid by the seller? Are there different benchmarks and different triggers? Are you doing a flat fee? Are you doing a percentage? Are you doing a combination or some other creative thing you can think of? That's entirely up to you, and well, also your broker, if you're not a broker yourself, but that's really up to your brokerage and the seller what you want to negotiate. So as far as extra money or not extra money, if you're focusing on what you want to get for compensation, and then as a listing broker, you're walking the seller through the option, which is, listen, the buyer is likely to ask you, most buyers cannot pay for their cooperating broker out of pocket. It's likely they're going to be asking you for compensation to pay that person as part of the purchase and sales agreement. They might also be asking you for concessions. That's a talking point for you to address in the listing agreement. And then at that point, some sellers may commit to a specific amount that they want to offer across the board. I think increasingly, and you tell us because you're out there in the field working with consumers, I think increasingly you're going to see sellers saying, I'm willing to compensate, but I want to see the whole package. How much is the buyer offering? Are they asking for other concessions too? And I'll have that factor into that decision about, am I willing to go with this specific percentage, rather than just committing to a blanket amount across the board. So I just wanted to address that. I don't know if John or Waldy, if you have anything to add to that comment, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same wavelength with it.
Yeah, I mean, we've sort of given that advice earlier on. Expect that conversation. Have obviously a net sheet with your seller will really help. So as offers are coming in and requests for compensation are included in those offers, the seller can weigh each offer against each other, right? They know what they're looking to walk away with, right? They know what their fees are going to, or their expenses are going to be. So as you said, Monica, so to ask the question up front, are you willing, the question could be, are you willing to pay the cooperating broker? And some sellers may say, no way, I'm not paying for that. The buyer's representative, it's like, well, but what if the offer comes in and it's, $50,000 over asking, right? Well, all right, well then maybe you are willing to, because it all you do your net sheet and you see what you're walking away with. So those conversations are important to have up front, have that net sheet, and help the seller, I guess, evaluate those offers as they come in.
I agree to that.
Waldy, are you seeing it? Have you seen it? And again, I know this is so new, so you're probably still dealing with things that were in the process got started before all these changes even. But are you seeing anything different for listing broker compensation? I don't mean the amount, but any kind of information that you're looking for. I don't know if anything has changed for you on that front.
Not as of yet, but I have seen where the buyer's agent negotiate their fee into the purchase and sale agreement. I've seen multiple purchase and sale agreement where it does show seller to pay buyer's agent X amount of commission. So that I have seen.
And we did add new language to our P&S agreement, Monica, correct? So, to make that transparent, and that, whether the buyer representative is being paid by, I guess, the buyer or the seller, or a combination of both, right? If somehow they're getting paid by more than one party, which is a possibility, right? And then that all needs to be in there. And right. And so, because I think we've heard that can really, sort of hold up a transaction. Then, as it gets to the closing table, and then they realize, wait, what, the buyer representative was being paid by two different people, and, it wasn't clear or whatever. So, so I think that was a pretty good addition to the P&S agreement.
Yeah, so I seen where like PNS has a percentage that is coming from the seller, and the buyer's agent also share like a buyer's agreement where they pay an additional percentage. So that is something that I have seen multiple times.
And you need to be made aware of that, obviously, as early as possible, right?
Right. It's very important because just so you know, we may know that the borrower may have only $15,000 on the account, and now at the end of the day, you did not disclose that to the lender. You only send it to the attorney. Now at the closing table, the cost to close went out to $20,000. Now the client can close because it's shorter on funds. So
yeah. Let's hope we can prevent that from happening to some people just by anyone who's listening to you today. So one thing that came up actually just probably in the last couple of weeks was a cooperating, basically the purchase and sales agreement we're just talking about. And the cooperating broker asked for a percentage of compensation based on a net sale. And what happened, and I'll give you time to think too if you would react to Waldy or John, but so what happened was no one defined what net was. So what the percentage of what, I might think that net is the gross purchase price minus repairs that the seller paid for. Or someone else might think that a net sale it's you're deducting concessions paid for by the seller. And so I don't know what you would have done with that had dropped into your lap as a lender, where it said this is the seller's paying the cooperating broker a percentage of net sale with no explanation. So if you got one like that, what might you do with it?
I will go by the purchase price. If you if you are considering a percentage and you say net sale, so unless you disclose, oh, I spend so much money, this is how much I'm gonna get, this is gonna be my net, so then that's a different story. But when when you disclose, we normally go by the purchase price, whatever the purchase price is.
And possibly, no, thanks for that. And possibly as an alternative, I mean, rather than net, since everyone, because even if you define what a net, someone defines what a net sale is, what would be deducted, there still could be some disagreement about what those amounts are. You know what I mean? If I say like, okay, I want to be paid on the gross minus repairs paid for by the seller. Well, anyway, so it's something like that. I wonder if it's just easier for someone to just say, here's a dollar amount. Like forget trying to figure out a percentage on a net sale. Here's a dollar amount that the buyer would like the seller to pay to the cooperating broker. But
Yeah.
we'll see where that goes. Then I have one other thing I just wanted to mention before we go back to some questions for Waldy and anything that John might want to ask. I actually received a very concerning legal hotline call the other day, and I'll tell you why it was concerning. Because it sounds like steering may have happened. So here's something not to do if you're a cooperating broker. I can understand that, obviously before you always knew upfront what you were going to be offered for compensation when it was being offered by the listing broker. Under the new system, you're in many cases will be looking to the seller to pay that compensation. And I completely understand why it's much easier to know upfront the seller is offering the same to everybody in every situation. However, as we were saying before, really, we're kind of shifting away from that. So here's the thing. The person contacted, and I'm hearing only one side of the story, not using names or other details. So, but listing broker was contacted by a cooperating broker. The buyers are, in a position to pay cash, no contingencies, etc. And they were looking at that property, looking at other properties. So very interested in that property, wanted to on the verge of making an offer. The cooperating broker asked the listing broker, okay, so what are you offering? Well, no, we're a listing broker. We're not offering compensation to cooperating brokers anymore. We're concerned about the Department of Justice and potentially antitrust issues. Okay, how much is the seller offering? And the listing broker said, put it in the purchase and sales agreement. The seller will entertain the whole package and negotiate it during that process. The cooperating broker, at least this is the alleged, this one side of the story I'm hearing, the cooperating broker said, well, my buyers have a lot of options. They can make an offer in a different property than this one. Okay.
Well,
So-
okay. So,
Waldy and John, who wants to chime in on that? I know what.
well, I mean, so who's first of all, the buyer who, that's a fiduciary, excuse me, the buyer broker has a fiduciary to the buyer, right? So, I'm the lawyer, so I guess I should turn this back around and ask you, Monica, but are those the buyer instructions that the buyer broker should not, that the buyer doesn't want to put an offer on any property where the seller isn't paying the buyer's broker's compensation? I don't know if that's the instruction of the buyer. I guess is that okay? But that doesn't sound like that doesn't seem to pass the smell test, right? I don't know why they.
And Waldy had a visual. I'm going to play poker with both of you two. So Waldy had a facial reaction too. So Waldy, do you want to weigh in on that one too?
Well, the listing agent just told them ask on the PNS, so they even though that the seller may not be paying, but if you ask, it's never hurt asking, so then if you get rejected, then you just have to go back to the buyer, so and explain the situation.
So to that point, and I guess this is a follow-up comment in here, and I guess so. It says they had a particular one that the cooperating broker demanded a certain amount, and when the seller gave them a reasonable amount, they pretty much told that the deal may not go through. But so, I guess if let's go back to buyer agreements, right? So if the buyer has agreed to pay X, right, to the buyer broker, then and so that goes into the offer, right? I'm the buyer and I say I want, seller to pay X to my buyer broker, and the seller counters with Y, which is less than X, right? Then there is sort of a problem, I guess, between the buyer, but it's between the buyer broker and the buyer, right? Where it's like, well, geez, Mr. Buyer, you agreed to pay me X through this negotiation. I'm only going to receive Y, and there's a shortfall. And so the buyer, I guess, under the agreement is ultimately responsible to pay that shortfall, right? unless the buyer broker decides they're not going to collect that. And so from that perspective, I mean, if that fee is ironclad and there's no wiggle room on the buy side where it's like, well, the buyer doesn't want to be stuck having to pay that difference, then they need to move on to the next listing where the seller will cover that whole fee. Does that, I mean,
Yeah, but you have that conversation with the buyer, and
yeah,
you give them that choice. And what was particularly disturbing, again, hearing one side of the story, that's my disclaimer. And I really didn't want to see the paper trail on this, but this was all put in writing in texts. And I have to say, this is steering. If you're doing, and we're seeing some, like John said, we're seeing some other people posting the Q&A say, yeah, this is happening to me too. This is steering, folks. This is what got us into, and I like to blame just Missouri because that's where the verdict was in the big case we saw last Halloween, the Sitzer Burnett case. And I'm saying like, hey, our people are great. We've been transparent about compensation. We're doing things right in Rhode Island. When I hear things like that, it's, if your buyer does not know that you're having that discussion, it's one thing to say to the buyer, okay, you've signed a contract with me for this amount, and then ask for the compensation as part of the purchase and sales agreement or even otherwise. And then if a seller says, no, not doing it, then the buyer has a decision. Do I want to push harder in the negotiations? Do I want to walk away? Do I want to, am I prepared to pay, whatever to my cooperating broker out of pocket? Yeah. And I'm not trying to say this is a wonderfully easy situation for cooperating brokers, but you can't make the decision for your buyer. You can't say like, oh, they just put it under, I mean, I'm not saying that that's what happened here at this point, but you can't just say like, okay, well, I'm going to tell them that, something's wrong with the property and have them go someplace else,
Yeah, no, obviously not. Right. And so I think Deborah sort of, comment is relevant. She said, what's the reason for asking if the seller is paying a buyer broker or not? It's only in the offer, the terms, and that to the seller that matters. It's all about the terms. So that's true. I mean, it's so, as you say, the buyer broker has to go back to the buyer, and then I guess the buyer has to decide, did they counter with something? Do they offer that much, over and above what they were going to offer before to bridge that gap or whatever? But it's a term that's going to be negotiated.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Oh, we have a new one that just came in. And I know I've got a few more questions that we already talked about in advance with Waldy, so make sure that we get to those as well. But Waldy, thank you for jumping into the fray with us with all these questions flying at us. Okay, so Rex says, under this scenario where there's a shortfall in the compensation offered to the cooperating broker by the seller, how does the buyer pay the difference to the broker? Or does it get included in closing funds from the buyer at closing? So Waldy, I don't know if you want to tackle that one.
All right. So that's touching base on before, is very important that you have that buyer's representation agreement, that you let the lender or the loan officer you're working with that you have to collect a fee, because we can build it into the closing costs, whether, assuming that the borrower's short on funds, we can figure different ways out to get that particular buyer, additional funds to help you, to help that buyer cover the buyer's representation agreement, so at closing, you can get the situation where the buyers, from the beginning of the transaction is assuming that they only have to bring X amount of dollar, and if you do it at closing, that X amount of dollars is gonna jump to another number where that can be a check to the buyer, and then it's gonna be sort of not a good communication or conversation, because usually the buyers, when they see that the dollar amount increases, you know how that goes. Everybody does not like to have to bring more money to the table. They always, assuming to bring less money to the table. So going back, I would say disclose to your lender immediately and in us as lender, we can even disclose more money that they have to bring to the table up front, even though that they don't necessarily have to bring that amount of money. But if you have the assumption that, hey, this can be a problem later on can potentially, it's gonna be an additional fee added. You want to disclose that to the lender, so that way we can disclose. And if you only gonna charge half of the fee, we can always adjust it later on. So it's always good to disclose it right at the beginning, I would say.
Okay, great. That makes a lot of sense. And for any of you who joined us a little bit late, people have been doing a great job so far, but if you just put your questions in the Q&A, we are happy to answer them. And let's see, I've got a couple more for Waldy. Before you were showing us that resource with a really great resource comparing kind of concessions across different kinds of loan products. One thing, although you reviewed it in general, there were some changes with the VA financing earlier this year. And I wonder if you could just walk us through that, because before it was what the buyers, it had to do with the buyers being able to, the compensation to a cooperating broker.
Right. So the VA traditionally did not allow the veterans to pay excessive fees. So they didn't permit the to pay for buyer's agent commission. So the VA temporarily removed that that condition where they are allowing the buyers to be able to pay for the buyer's commission. That's a temporarily ban that they put on the law. I'm not sure if they're gonna make it permanent. But previously the VA buyers were not allowed to pay for the buyer's agent commission. So now they can, as of now.
Great. No, thanks. That's helpful. And I'm just wondering, are there, sorry, going through, you covered so much ground already that I'm kind of, just want to make sure that we ticked off everything that you're prepared to answer. So, because you've been doing some winging it too. So one thing I think that's puzzling is with some of the programs like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, et cetera. So all of these years, you could argue that compensation was built into the price of a house. Right? Because the buyers bring, even if it comes out of the seller's proceeds, it's the buyers bringing the money to the table. And it was conditioned on not standard compensation, because that's a dirty word to say that, but it was conditioned on compensation being paid to a listing broker and or a cooperating broker. That was always kind of factored into sort of the price of the house overall. But then when you separate those two, seller paying listing broker, buyer paying cooperating broker, all of a sudden, it seems like most loan programs say, oh yeah, it's still okay to pay the seller out of that. But on the buy side, that can't be financed. So, and you've been talking about a lot of good issues for people who are listing already, but do you see any changes potentially happening at the national level with Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or anybody else?
I overheard that they may be working on something. What I can potentially anticipate that they might be able to increase the seller concession. But that's what my guess, one of the things that they can do to allow, sort of more flexibility, as far as negotiation wise, so the buyers agent can negotiate probably a potential higher seller concession to go toward the buyer, so the buyer can have enough funds potentially to be able to pay for the buyer's agent commission. But as of now, I haven't heard anything like concrete. So but that's my wild guess that's one of the flexibility that they can do, increase that seller concession. That would be awesome.
Yeah, that would be good too. And because I think one of the things too is like, if a buyer wants to pay, I mean, basically, if I'm a buyer why is it anyone's business if I'm paying, except for the lenders? Why is it anyone's business if I sign a contract to pay my broker, the one who's representing me, whether it's a penny or $1 million, like, why is that? Why should the seller have to have control over that, or the listing broker? I think all these lawsuits and the Department of Justice, I think it's kind of opened eyes a bit, because that's the old system was really the listing broker is dictating and the seller dictating what the cooperating broker gets paid. But even now, under this, kind of this new system, it's still to an extent, like, you still have the buyer contract, but if the buyer doesn't have any money, they don't even have money for a down payment, let alone paying for a representation out of pocket, and then the seller says no to the compensation.
Right.
You were talking about a couple of things that your brokerage, mortgage brokerage does, Waldy, and then also with Rhode Island Housing, but still, it's like it's still in a position where, to some extent, the seller is kind of dictating what the cooperating broker can get paid. So don't know where we stand with all of that.
I mean, I guess the flexibility that the buyer has is in what they offer on the property, right? I mean, if the seller is not willing to pay the amount that the buyer wants, then what, they have to offer more money on the home, right? But then they run into, then the buyers are paying more, right? Which is what the opposite of supposed to happen with this lawsuit, right? They want home prices to come down or whatever, but also it has to appraise, right? I mean, there are issues there, Waldy.
Correct. So that's I feel like that's one of the biggest hurdles, that offering more money can be okay, because as far as the monthly payment goes for the buyer, if you get enough money, you might be able to use those funds from the seller concession to be able to buy down the rate, even though you're offering more money to buy the property. You can pay the buyer's commission. You can use some of those funds to buy the interest rate down, where your monthly payment can still be similar or the same, as assuming that you offering 500,000 on a home, and you estimate a monthly payment is gonna be let's just put a number, $3,000, right? And you go out and offer $515,000, you estimated payments is gonna increase about $100. But what can you do to still lower that monthly payment to that $3,000 initially? You can buy down the interest rate enough to be able to have the same amount of monthly payment, even if you offering more money for the house. So so the buyers don't necessarily have to have a higher payment because they offering a lot more money for the house. So that's something that you may want to discuss with your lender. Is this an option that might benefit the buyer? Or do the buyer need that funds to pay for the closing costs, or can that money be used to buy down the interest rate? So those are something that having a conversation with the lender can help out achieving the goal. But also keep in mind the appraisal. The appraisal is very important.
Yeah, right. Great.
I can't believe this, but I think we're really running out of questions here. So
listen, yeah, I'm not going to complain. You can probably hear my stomach rumbling. I mean, who scheduled this for lunchtime anyway? Whose idea was that? If we end early.
Mine. I thought I had something else earlier, but it was
oh my
to another
God.
time. So
I'm not going to complain.
That's okay. So Waldy, do you want to I think you really covered this throughout the discussion today, but do you have any kind of other tips that you would like to recommend to realtors who are listening today and who will be listening on the video, just to make under this new system, what's going to make the transaction go more smoothly? You talked about communication.
Communication is key. Communication is everything. So you want to be able to speak to your lender, have your lender disclose even the lender can give you information about, hey, this client may be short on funds. You have to negotiate 115% or whatever the closing costs are. You know, if you buy, you want to have full transparency with your lender. So that's, you know, my tip for every realtor. You want to be able to communicate early in the game, so that way you know whose buyer you're working with, so that way you can have more of smooth transaction with the buyer, where the buyer doesn't feel like one person is telling me one thing and the other person is telling me another thing. So communication is key. So you want to be able to work with a lender that can help educate those buyers, so that way when they get to you, back to you, they feel like you're working as a team, you know, so you're not just telling one thing and the lender's telling another thing, you know, so yeah.
Right.
It looks like under the wire, someone just posted something in the Q&A.
I answered it.
And John, if you want to read that one, but I'm just going to tell everyone I'm putting a link in the chat from our communications department about an event coming up with NAREB.
Actually, it was just a thank you for the information comment. So there's no question. Sorry.
You can read the thank you. You want to thank, especially
I just
thanking
missed it already.
Waldy.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you very much. I think this was
Yes.
helpful. Hopefully everybody got something out of this.
So I just saw the chat, and so the NARAB is having an event. The event is gonna be hosted on October 10 from 6 to 9. So if you have a minute, you can guys look up the NARAB Providence. So it's gonna be great information also. So it's called Money Mindset. So it's gonna be a workshop.
Great.
Excellent. Is that the money mindset to help our members with, to help realtors with financing issues or structuring compensation, or?
So I don't have the full details, but it's gonna be talking about finances.
Okay,
Great.
excellent. Good. Oh, now we're getting more questions in.
No, people don't want to see me go eat.
No, they don't. They want you to pass out from starvation.
I think that's what it is. Right.
I'll tell you one thing, and then I know John is dying to read some of these questions, but you know, frankly, our goal is that we don't need any more of these webinars, because you're feeling, I'm hoping, and John is too, I'm sure, that, you know, that you feel like you're in a spot where at least you understand the shift in the settlement agreement. Offices have adopted policies, things are starting to click a bit. We hope that that's the case, because our goal would be to end up with 0 people attending these webinars, because you feel like you know what's going on. And then we can talk about other things for a change, like the lead registry. No, anyway.
So
Okay,
yeah,
John,
I think we kind of covered this. So I think, you know, this sort of goes back to concessions, but the question is, so why can't the P&S stipulate that the seller will pay a certain amount towards closing costs and not professional service fee? If a seller contributes X to closing costs and some or all of it covers compensation, doesn't that equate to the buyer paying their own agent? I mean, that's an option, right? There are one of two ways. I think we talked about that it can be handled, right? So as you said earlier, Waldy, the seller could pay X amount towards closing costs. And I guess one of those costs that the seller, so the buyer gets those funds and then uses it to pay down whatever they have to pay. And then a portion of that can pay the buyer broker directly, right?
Correct. So so put it in numbers. Assuming that you get $15,000 seller concession fee, right? And out of that 15,000, your fees, let's say percentage wise, and that percentage wise is equivalent to 5,000, right? So technically, when we disclose on the loan estimate that goes out to the buyer, it's gonna have your fee, the buyer's agent fee on the loan estimate. So $10,000 gonna help out covering the fees for attorney, application, and all the closing costs fees, and 5,000 out of that 15 is gonna go toward your fee. So we roll that fee into a closing cost fee.
So I guess one of the challenges though, so in some of these, like for example, I'm looking at that chart you shared. So Fannie Mae says I can have 6% in concessions, right? Is that so let's just use that number. Just say, for example, that a buyer can get up to 6% for concessions for closing costs or whatever. But let's say the buyer needs that whole amount for whatever other things that they need them for. Is there a reason then that you would want the seller to pay the broker directly because it doesn't impact that concession threshold, right?
Right. So you may want to roll your fee that come directly from the seller.
So it doesn't impact the concession threshold.
So that concession will be utilized for the buyer's closing costs, the standard closing costs for the buyers.
And so the follow-up comment is that our section 18 in our, that must be in the listing agreement, only talks about the professional service. Oh, and the PNS.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's because it's different, right? I mean, section 18 is about professional services fee, but the closing costs can be covered somewhere else. Is that right, Monica? You're the forms expert. Help.
Yep. All I can say
share the
is
document too if I need to, by the way, if we want to.
well,
But
all of the forms, whether it's the MLS listing agreements, the Rhode Island Association of Realtors buyer representation agreements, transaction facilitator agreements, or purchase and sales agreements, every one of those documents has a space for additional provisions. So that's where you would put any specific negotiation like that, additional provisions. The reason we have a standalone section for professional services fee is frankly, we want to make sure that that our members can still get paid for the valuable services that they perform. And with all the changes going on, we want to make sure that there was a special spot to draw that to everyone's attention. And so, because I think in the past, particularly in Rhode Island, I mean, there are other states like Connecticut where people have been required to use written buyer contracts for years. But I would venture a guess that until this year, that a huge number of our members had either never used a buyer buyer contract, or maybe they've used it a couple of times, but not part of their regular practice. So, and if people in the past haven't been used to talking about buyers about how they get paid, or even listing brokers maybe getting into great discussion about payment, how compensation was paid to a cooperating broker. That's why it was maybe more in your face than just having additional provisions or having a separate concession section. So, over time, these forms will change. It really based on your needs, those of you who are listening and members of our association. For those of you who haven't heard this before, that we have a forms committee. They're volunteer realtors from different parts of the state, different types of practice areas. And so I work with them to develop forms, make changes to forms. And if you have any questions like this, like the comment we just had, I take every single question or comment I get from a member of our association, from an attorney, from anybody, and a consumer. If someone contacted me, I take all of those and give them to our forms committee. And they make the decision. They say, is this something that we need to add? Like, for example, do we need a separate section for concessions, or is additional provisions work as it is? We'll take that to the forms committee, and they'll evaluate that as fellow practitioners and put that there. So, John, there's one thing that I always forget the website, even when I write it down. So, to go to resources for the settlement agreement, and where our video of this program will be posted sometime tomorrow. What is that website, John?
RIRealtors.org/CPR.
Thank you. Okay, /CPR. I'm getting older. I don't remember all these things. All right, now we still have a couple of things in Q&A, and then I think oh gosh, it looks like we're gonna wrap right up the time we were planning to anyway. Okay, so John, it looks like these couple of questions are for you. They're questions about the multiple listing service and.
Yeah, they're a little off topic. I don't know. I mean, there are questions about participating in MLS as non-realtors. And so there's not been a formal decision made yet on that. or a final decision. There's a vote going out to members to deal with that. So once that happens, then we'll have to, depending on which way the vote goes, right? Whether Realtor membership is a requirement for participation in the MLS or not, we'll then have to move forward with answering other questions. So, but that is yet to be determined or finally voted on, I guess we'll say.
Yeah, so if anyone's interested in that issue, you should have received something about the annual meeting of the Rhode Island Association of Realtors. That will be a Zoom meeting. We'll be voting on bylaws changes to see if we should remove that requirement that you have to be a member of the Realtor Association to access MLS. So take a look, go back through your stuff. If you want to attend, make your voice heard, you are welcome to do that. And then we'll have additional details after that. Okay, so I think rather than running out the clock, I especially want to thank, of course, I thank John for being here because we're both
Thank
stuck
you,
here
Monica.
to work
Thank you.
together. But the person we really both want to thank is Waldy Ripoll. Ripoll. I know I was trying to roll my R. I told Waldy I couldn't do that. I've tried to learn rolling my R's forever. Can't do it. So Waldy Ripoll.
Ripoll.
Accent, right?
Yes.
Sounds better when you say it because you can roll your R's. Anyway, from Movement Mortgage was our special guest today. And we thank you so much for walking us through these burning questions that people have had about financial issues, lending issues, etc. And certainly feel free to call upon Waldy or any lender for questions. But just make sure what the content we've had today, whatever lender that you or your clients choose to use, just make sure they're aware of the settlement agreement, aware of these changes, and don't leave anything to chance. As Waldy said, like do that upfront communication. Don't wait until like a week before the closing and say, oh, surprise, here's my compensation statement. And then as some of the people who posted the Q&A earlier said, rethink, you may all that money that you're used to holding in an escrow account as a listing broker. Maybe you're not holding that anymore. Maybe you don't want to hold it at all. Maybe you want to just hold part of the portion that would go towards your compensation as the listing broker. But have those conversations with both the lender, with the buyer's consent, closing attorney, and of course, make sure your own client knows what's going on. John and Waldy, any parting words here?
So for those that would like to have more information or may have an additional question, my phone number is 401-868-5868. My office is located at 1215 Reservoir Avenue on Cranston, Rhode Island. So if you guys would like me to share that seller concession sheet, more than happy to do so. So feel free to contact me if you have any other questions.
And that number again was?
401-868-5868.
5868. Okay. All right, everybody. Great. I think we are over and out because we don't want to see John pass out on the floor.
That's
from
right.
His starvation, not from drinking, but starving.
Right? Exactly. All right, okay, everybody. Everyone. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Waldy.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Waldy. Take care.
Bye. Bye.